Stoic point of view is don't worry about tomorrow. Take care of the moment, because if you take care of the moment, you won't need to worry about tomorrow.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin. Today I have the privilege of talking again with Kai Whiting. Kai is a researcher and lecturer in sustainability and Stoicism. For anyone who's been a long-time listener of the podcast, you'll know that he's been on a couple times. This is his third appearance. Figured he would be a great guest to have on to talk about God. So we talk about God, particularly the Stoic God, but we touch base with Christianity and other religions as well, and sort of the whole breadth of what God really means, and really trying to answer the question, is it stupid for modern man to believe in God? So I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you do as well. Hello, Kai. How are you? Thanks for joining me again, man. Great to have you back.
I love this podcast. I really enjoy what you do, and it's so nice to be talking to a friend. It's just really great to be here, and it's really great to speak to your audience again. And I really hope that they get something out of this quite complex. Every time we do a podcast, it seems to be complex, but this is actually more controversial in many ways than our talk about animals, for example. So I'm really looking forward to digging deep and seeing if we can grow a pair of shoulders for other people to stand on.
Yeah. Well, what I like about our discussion so far, it's always those things, those controversial issues. And it's good. It's good because we can sort of gel between us and hopefully convince some people to not be so absolute in their thinking. So let me introduce today's topic. I guess the question that sort of spurred this, in the most blunt way I can put it, is it stupid for modern man to believe in God? Okay. Not the most academic way of saying it, but that's basically what I'm trying to get here. And I guess the goal for today's episode is to not make the initial response to be yes. If you believe in God in any sense of the word, and we're going to get into that, you're not just automatically stupid and dumb and unscientific and yada, 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 yada. And the reason I think this question is really important, it's always been important, but particularly now, is we've reached a stage where I think what everyone used to mean by God has sort of gotten lost throughout the years. And I think part of this has been, obviously, science has played a huge role in this, right? We used to think that thunder was Thor smacking his hammer. Now we have a scientific explanation for that. So in some sense, we've sort of disproven a lot of the ideas of God, at least in some ways. But that's the key point, in some ways. And so the idea of God is a lot deeper than I think most people give it credit for. And it's a very broad word, I believe. And so that's sort of what I wanted to get into with you today. And I think, you'd be a great person to talk about with this. So we're going to throw in some Stoicism. We're going to throw in some God, maybe a little bit of Nihilism. It's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. Just to start, I want to get you talking as soon as possible here. I want to ask you to just give an overview sort of how broad that word is, God. Because now we think about a deity, but all what it can possibly mean at all.
That's a very broad question, but yeah, I often say, and I do believe this, is there are around about 8 billion gods on this planet, right? In the sense that everybody has their own conceptualization of God. And I mean, some people think their conceptualization of God is that there is no God, and the way they've come to that decision will also differ. So there's no sort of journey in towards or out of God's kind of reach. So I do feel there is a lot to cover. Of course, there are different types of gods. In the West, we tend to think who has the monopoly on God? It's the Abrahamic gods, so the Jewish faith, Islam, and Christianity, which automatically puts you into the category of things like a supernatural God, a personal God that wants to hear from you, who wants to have an open communication with you, that sets down some rules, that created a natural law, and then said, this is what I want from you, this is how you show that you appreciate me, potentially love me, that's a loaded word, I know, or at least follow me. So, you can have Christians who see God as the God of love, you can see Christians who see God as their father. some people, for example, might have an issue with their own biological father, so they don't find it as easy to see God as their father. They might see God as the leader of, say, a force of God, of good. So that's, one sense. You've got, in Islam, you've got a God that you would pray to at least 5 times a day, a very communal aspect of religion that's based on aspects of nature in terms of when you're called to pray at Fajr, the dawn prayer, and when you're called at Maghrib, the sunset prayer, and Isha. That will change. That's the last prayer of what we would call a day, right? And so there's a very sort of natural communal part of that. The Jewish faith has a very strong tie to being a member of a tribe, being quite inclusive within the tribe, and then excluding others outside the tribe who do not follow 630 mikveh or rules. Okay, there are, again, Jewish communities that are going to be less focused on who's in the community and who's not, but traditionally that was the way that was. Then also you've got sort of paganistic kind of gods, like, you've got your Thors, the idea that there are natural elements and that we would tie those natural elements to God, which links into some aspects, pantheistic interpretations of God. So God is nature, God is the earth. God in that sense is not necessarily supernatural, but it's the entire extension of what we call the natural. So in that sense, Stoicism has some ties to to different things within that. And then you've got gods within other cultures, which I'm really not an expert to talk about. I wouldn't be comfortable saying I know what the people believe in the Buddhist or the Hindu faith. That's not the case. But then you have a whole way of thinking about that kind of God. And for example, Hinduism, people think it's a polytheistic religion in some aspects. Depending on what you look at, you'd say it's more like how God is made manifest, as opposed to being a truly polytheistic religion. So there's a whole thing, and then you've got other people who take a bit of each, right? So they're like the fact, for example, that there's this aspect of nature, but they are Catholic, and they pray, for example, to the Virgin Mary, but they do like the aspects of being at one with nature, and they would go out and find God in nature and really find that their church is being outside and planting and farming. And other people who are more like, no, I like to be physically in a temple, I physically enjoy being there, it's not really a strongest connection with nature per se. So you've got, not only have you got like various renditions of God, you've also got many ways of interpreting that relationship with God. So whenever I find that blasphemy is a really interesting term, because people seem to think it's taking God's name in vain. I would also argue quite strongly that blasphemy is ascribing things to God that God did not do. So saying God did this or God dislikes you, I'm like, that's a form of blasphemy. How do you know that? You're taking God's name and saying he or it or she, depending on how you want to refer to God, did this, when actually that may well reflect your own biases, interpretations. So I think blasphemy actually covers more things than saying, oh my, for example, right? Because I think, okay, that's one thing. But surely just as bad is to say God did this or God did that or God made me do that, or there's no other alternative to that. Because although God may be completely true, well, how you interpret that doesn't mean that you're right. And so I think there's a lot of things that people who have a faith, big capital, like Christianity, and then claim that God does something, can be just as wrong as an atheist who says, you're stupid if you don't believe in God. It's pathetic that you don't believe in God. And it's like, well, you don't even know why they believe in that God, or what interpretation they have, or what is their God. For example, if they, and this is James Daughtry's argument, that if my God is a tree, if that literally is my God, like I can point to an oak tree in a garden somewhere, and an atheist says to me, your God doesn't exist, your God is not real, that your God, how pathetic it is. Well, my God's an oak tree, look at that tree. So I always whenever I speak to atheists, well, what do you mean by my God, first of all, right? Don't always assume that I believe in, say, I don't know, Jesus Christ dying on the cross, or that I'm part of a unique set of people, or that I'm a follower of a particular prophet, right? If my God is a tree, then you cannot claim my God does not exist, right? And that's a James Doctrine argument. He'll like that for me mentioning that, but I think it's actually a good point. So I think that, again, in philosophy, it's about asking, okay, what do you mean by God? Before assuming that... so that answers it some way. Like, is it stupid? Depends what your God is. Is it stupid to have your tree as a God? Have a tree as a God? Well, depends, doesn't it? Depends on why you have it that way. People might say, well, what does a tree do? Well, you might say, it provides me with oxygen, right? And if your God doesn't even exist, then, potentially you are the silly one to say to me that my God is stupid. So that's a good example of automatically assuming that your God and the person that you're speaking to's God is the same.
Right. Yeah, I often think about God as, in the most broadest sense of the word, which encompasses everything you just talked about there, as sort of being like psychologically something that is above you, right? Because, and I think part of me thinks that this is because psychologically speaking, we can't handle absolute power. And so over time, we've sort of developed, in ancient Mesopotamia, they had this idea of Marduk. And even the king was subservient to Marduk, or Marduk, sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong. To even the king was subservient to Marduk. And basically, like every year, they would, I think it was around New Year's, the priest would come down, they'd take off all their fancy clothes and fancy jewelry, and the priest would slap them right across the face. And so the idea of God there was sort of as a force of humility, sort of this humbling thing that you are still, even the most powerful human being is subservient to something, because I think that comes from the psychological fact that we humans just cannot handle absolute power. And so it's very interesting you mentioned this relationship we have with God as well, because it's, again, we're so sort of biased to think about it in the Abrahamic way, particularly Christianity in the West, right? Like and Jewish as well, but it is sort of this, we do tend to think about that. And it's also manifested in a lot of our, let's say, pop media. Like a lot of people that grew up in my time, Family Guy. Family Guy portrays God as being this man with a white beard and a white gown, and he's standing on a cloud, and he's, yelling at Peter for doing something stupid. So, basically our media has sort of portrayed this image of God as being just ridiculous. Just this, what do you mean? You think there's a man up there standing on the clouds? Like, come on, what are you talking about? And then, I think we've sort of had ignorance inbred into us, and we really need to take a step back and say, okay, what does that word really mean? And what, not even does it really mean, because that changes obviously, but what could that potentially mean? What's the breadth of that word?
That's a better question.
And yes, exactly. And I think maybe this is a good time to get into sort of the Stoic God a little bit. And I know you've spoken, there's a really great, I want to mention this, you and Leonidas, which is the co-author of your book, and Simon did a masterclass series on Stoicism as a whole. And the last topic was on the Stoic God. And so that's definitely worth checking out just for the listeners. It's a really great chat. It's on YouTube for sure.
Yeah, the practical, I think, comes under the Practical Stoic podcast, and some aspects come under the Walled Garden, just in case people don't know who Simon is. Simon Drew. So
right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah. So let's talk about the Stoic God a little bit. And I've always seen, because you read Stoic books, the ancient Stoics, and you sort of hear this word. You hear them mention Zeus a lot. You hear them mention nature quite often as well. And you also have passages from Marcus Aurelius that, from my perspective, I sort of see him as struggling with the idea of God, meaning he's not sure and he's not unsure. He's kind of struggling a little bit with this idea of God. He has this passage that's something like, if God is real, then be virtuous and you'll have a great life in heaven. If he's not real, well, you're just going to go to sleep and you've lived a great life. So you live on and you have great memories. And if God is real, but he's not just, well, you don't want to serve that God anyway. So, I'll let you get in here.
I did speak to scholars about that, and they do feel it I guess they see it as how I would say it, having a belief in God, and then saying, even if God isn't real, that doesn't mean that I didn't believe. So there's a lot of scholars who don't think that Marcus Aurelius had this faith crisis, right? They really think he's just saying, even if that's not the case, this is the case. And even if that's not the case, this is the case, right? It's like you saying, for example, well, even if you don't go to the gym, right? then, but if you do go, it doesn't mean that you do or you don't go. It doesn't mean, it's just you reflecting on, okay, you don't have to be healthy, you don't have to go to the gym. In fact, there are a lot of people that go to the gym who aren't healthy, right? However, if you do go, right, and then they think, the scholars think that is what he's kind of doing. He's reflecting, he's basically strengthening his own conviction in the belief in God. So it's actually not a doubt. That's what scholars say. I mean, I am a scholar myself, but I'm not the expert on Marcus Aurelius by any stretch of the imagination, which is why I've made a few phone calls. But they do say there doesn't seem to be, based on the rest of the contextual analysis of meditations, which is a private thing. He's not being a Seneca. He's not publicly saying, "Oh, look at me," and on mercy. Like, this is Nero is such a merciful man, and he's so young, and he never ever caused bloodshed, which he did, like a couple months before. He never caused bloodshed, and therefore he is a brilliant emperor, right? He was doing that for a political reason. With meditations, which was just, which was his personal diary, that's not the case. So he's not trying to have this like discourse in a sense, but he is kind of strengthening his own conviction in the belief in God. That is an interpretation, of course, and people could argue with me about that all day, and that's fine. I'm just saying there's very few scholars who would say he didn't believe in God.
Right, but I guess the point is that, like, because I think the fact that it is a meditation, it is his own journal, sort of strengthens the idea that he was struggling with that. Because, like, if I'm writing in my journal, I'm not going to write about things that I have strong conviction in. I'm going to write about things, like for example, to mention the gym thing, you could say, okay, well, if I don't go to the gym today, I might not get much time in, but if I do go to the gym, at least I get a little bit of time in. Like, even if I'm sort of having this mental idea with myself, I'm having it because I'm struggling with that question: should I go to the gym or not? And so I do agree that I think Marcus Aurelius would have, he was leaning more towards faith as opposed to not. But the fact that he's even writing about this, I think, is suggests that maybe he had a wavering in his faith, and at least in a moment. I mean, if you go by the Christian idea of Jesus Christ on the cross saying, "God, you have forsaken me," even the idea there being even God himself can question his faith.
Oh yeah,
right? So,
I mean, you could say for potentially during that sentence, right? I don't know necessarily that it follows. He might, for all we know, he could have had a debate with somebody, and then because if I was to do a thing, because I debate people as part of my job all the time. Sometimes in my personal things, not writing, because I write academically as my kind of way of thinking about it. I might then think in my head, like I've had, we had the animal debate, and I spent a lot of time in my head, not necessarily because I had doubts, but because I had really strong convictions, and going, but how do I make my convictions clear? How can I argue that in a better way? So it could be either or, right?
Right.
I'm not disagreeing. I wasn't there. I'm not him. I wasn't there, and you're not saying that either. I'm saying that there's almost always the interpretation that he was doubtful. An equally reasonable interpretation could be he's looking at his convictions and he's working it through, like why he's so convicted. Neither of us are going to know the answer, and I'm not disagreeing with you, or disagreeing with me. And so I guess for the audience, it's like we cannot assume based on the one line that it is a doubt. It may well be. Scholars say that it is unlikely to be just because of what else he writes, right? And even if it could be for even if it's for 30 seconds. But what has been used by some modern Stoics within the contemporary Stoic community is that therefore he wasn't really sure, and therefore he didn't see it as important. They've gone down
that's a whole different.
They followed a different white rabbit, if we're going to, because the Matrix would have come out by the time this comes out. They followed a different white rabbit and came down a different hole. So that one thing is saying he had, a moment of doubt. Another possibility is he's got his convictions and he's working why he has those convictions. Because even if God doesn't exist, I'm still doing the right thing as a Stoic. That's the conviction that he may have had. But to then take it down. Therefore, if I say, therefore he never doubted, that's too extreme. But to say, therefore, it wasn't that important, or therefore we can remove the Stoic God from the Stoic ethics, it's like, how did you make that bridge? Because I don't see it in the text. And if you are interested in the ancient Stoics, and you don't want the word God, you're going to have to if you actually did this, I tell people to do things like this, get a black pen, and every time you see the word God, Zeus, Providence, divine, anything like that, get a black pen and mark it out. and you'll see how blinded you have to be, because if you don't do it, you're like, you just pass for God, I don't believe in that. You'll get a black pen and you'll go, oh my gosh, it's like 300 times God is mentioned. So they never ever quite... the argument that we have today is there a God, is there not a God, and is that God important within Stoicism? That equivalent argument in terms of whether the disagreement was, should we have private or public property? So the ancient Stoics really had that debate, which should be private property or only public property, and that's the kind of disagreement level that they had for that we have now in the contemporary community, of whether it should be a modern Stoic or quote-unquote traditional Stoic approach.
Right.
It's that.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because I see a lot of people adopting Stoicism as sort of this alternative to Christianity. And the reason they do so, I think, is because, okay, well, and religion, we can get into religion a little bit, but people associate, I suppose, a lot of the things with the church directly with Christianity, and obviously there is definitely a strong connection there. But I see a lot of people, nevertheless, doubting their faith in Christianity, maybe doubting their faith in God, as in the Christian God, let's say, and then they get the impression that Stoicism is sort of a more modern way of adopting a lot of the Christian principles, yet without this, the nutty, without the God baggage. Yeah, so it's like, okay, we can just, you know what I mean? And that's how people think about this. And then I think I want to get your thoughts on this, but I think what a lot of people end up doing is, hopefully they dig into Stoicism a little bit, and they start reading books, and they say, okay, God, okay, I'm just going to ignore that line because he mentions God. It goes on to the other things, and, but eventually, if you dig deep enough, you realize that you cannot just remove providence, the idea of determinism that's in Stoicism, and even free will, and God and providence. You can't just remove that and then say, okay, now we have Stoicism without the stuff that isn't really real anymore, because it has to be important. And I know you have really, really great thoughts and examples and a great way of speaking about this. So I want to let you go here, but like, what do you think about this modern, like, sort of taking Stoicism, removing God, removing providence, and then, I mean,
did you do the same originally, or you never had that issue?
Well, for me personally, I've never really asked the question about God too much, right? Like, I just didn't. And I was actually, in preparation for this talk, I was looking back through my old journal. And so years ago, I did some meditation and some thinking and journaling, and I tried to come up with what God meant to me. So I was never completely ignorant to the idea of God, but I was like, what does it really mean to me? And what came out was something like, God is, being like living a good life, being a good person, and then having faith that things will work out for you in the end. It was something like that. And now that definition, I agree with some parts of it, I don't agree with other parts of it. But certainly the faith element of, what do I believe in, and if I do this, things are going to get better, I think that's fundamental to a lot of philosophies and a lot of religions. So I guess to answer the question, I rarely ask myself that question, do I believe in God? It's not something, and maybe it's because I think about it more naturally in the Stoic sense of the word, right? So what is the Stoic sense of the word?
Well, I'll answer your first question. Yes, a lot of people come to Stoicism because they've had a faith crisis, because the belief that they had before, which tends to be Christianity but not necessarily, no longer serves them. However, they like the structure. I mean, Christianity provides a structure for you, and it provides you a nice thing to do on a Sunday, right? Or a Saturday, depending on your exact faith. And you want that. You don't want to think that you've got nothing, that everything that you've believed in has absolutely no value. So Stoicism does kind of, if you take it very superficially, if you take the self-help part, right? Because I think what you get if you take away the God, providence, divine is self-help, right? It's not that it's useless. It's not that it's not good, not helpful. It's just self-help. So I'm like, yeah, you can do that. Like, for me, how to be a Stoic from Massimo Pilucci is a really useful self-help book. Where Massimo and I disagree is whether it's really how to be a Stoic, right? So, but am I going to say there's no value in that book whatsoever? No, I've got a copy, and I think there's value in it. I do think it's a useful book. Do I think that it's really Stoic? Hard for me to argue yes it is, because of the way that it removes the entire foundation for the Stoic virtue. So people will come to Stoicism and then believe, I was infantile, for example, to believe in God. So what I'll do instead is I'll believe that virtue is the only good. Okay, based on what? If you've got no Stoic theology, you can say, okay, virtue is good, right? You can argue those cases because you don't need a Stoic argument for that. The Stoics never argued that virtue is good. Aristotle argued that virtue is the highest good. The Stoics were really fundamental on this, like virtue is the only good. So I'm not arguing that virtue is good, I'm not arguing that it's the highest good, I'm actually arguing that it's the only good. That externals, so money, ice cream, they're not necessarily good in and of themselves. Well, they are not good in and of themselves. It's how I use them to cultivate my character, right? That makes my character either good or not. So in the sage's case, the character is good. In my case, it might, it's being shaped by me doing appropriate things. So when people say to me, I don't believe in God because I can't prove there's a God in any way, shape or form, and therefore I don't really need it, I'm like, prove to me virtue is the only good.
Right.
No one's been able to. They've been able to argue with me, even like today. Actually, we're arguing about, I can prove to you within the Stoic framework that virtue is the only good. Good. Prove to me that the Stoic framework is correct. Prove to me that I should be a Stoic. Prove it to me. Prove it. I want proof that I should be a Stoic. That it's really I couldn't possibly be an Aristotelian. That would be ridiculous. I would never approach eudaimonia.
Yeah.
And then I've said it's a faith-based statement, and people haven't liked that. Said, I don't think it's a faith-based statement. Well, you have to believe that your path towards eudaimonia is worth having, and that the Aristotelians are incorrect, because otherwise you wouldn't be a Stoic. Like, there is an element of faith there. Is it the faith in the sense that can I work it through logically? Yes, I can work it through logically, but at some point I have to take a step. That's why Zeno's like when he's arguing for Stoicism. He says, he'd ask you the question: Do you believe that the point of human existence is to flourish? Now you could say no, right? You say no, I don't think it is. I think the point of human existence is to have pleasure that doesn't cause me pain, and to be in my garden, drinking wine, sitting in my community, and not having unnecessary pain. That makes you an Epicurean. So hang on a minute. So not every Greek school believed that the point of humanity is to flourish. They'll say it differently. They'll say sort of contentment or happiness, but not flourishing in the because they wouldn't use the word flourishing. They use the word eudaimonia specifically. To me, that's a faith. At some point, you have to say which is what do I want to believe? What do I want to follow? And I'm sorry, and they're going to argue with me on Facebook all day tomorrow about it. But at some point, you have to say, what is it that makes sense to me, and why does it make sense?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I completely agree. I think for you to think that you can live life with no faith, without any faith, and I'm not using the faith. This is an interesting thing. We think about faith, these words, faith, God, heaven, all these words in sort of this one way, based on the sort of the Christian idea. It's no fault of our own, I suppose. It's what we were brought into. But if you think you can go through life without faith, I mean, I cannot picture a particular way that you can. Even Sam Harris for those who don't know, Sam Harris is like the, basically, we can base all morality on facts. Yeah, one of the four horsemen, exactly. Yeah, so he's a big proponent of, we don't need any faith in life. We can basically just have base everything on fact, morality, everything on facts. But in his debate with Peterson pushed him to the point where he actually did end up saying, well, yeah, eventually you have to put your post somewhere. And what he meant, and eventually you have to say, okay, I have to assume this. I have to just make a leap of faith, right? And even if you take away everything that the Stoics meant by God, even if you take away heaven, whatever you're practicing in life, whatever is your particular philosophy or philosophy of life, that is a faith-based thing. You are living based on faith. You're living based on the faith, based on believing that if you do that, things will get however you want them to get. Probably it means something like better, broadly speaking.
Well, you have to believe, for example, that if you work to cultivate a good character, you achieve eudaimonia. Like, there's nothing I could do to prove that, because if I could, I haven't found a sage yet. So if I had found a sage, I could point to the sage and say, look. But seeing as I haven't seen a phoenix recently, it's quite... I mean, because the Stoics would say, you can point to say what Brandon does and say, that looks like courage. It's not, that is courage. That looks like courage. Because it's internal. People often think that, and this is even like how to be a Stoic, it's almost always framed as an external thing. But courage is an internal character. It's not external. There's nothing external about eudaimonia. It's inside. It's literally being you're the round peg who wants to go through the round hole. Right. That's what you want. That's the sage. Unfortunately, I'm the square peg, and I'm like trying to force myself through the round hole, and it doesn't work because I'm not. You either achieve eudaimonia or you don't.
Right.
Again, that's a belief system, isn't it?
It is a belief system. Any time when you have an ideal, which you inevitably do when you are trying to make yourself better in however you define it. Whenever you have an ideal, by definition, you are having a leap of faith in how you attain that ideal. And I mean, Nietzsche said that if you attain your ideal, you thereby surpass your ideal. Meaning, if we say, okay, my ideal is Kai Whiting. If I become Kai Whiting through, let's say as successful, however we measure it, I know this is very arbitrary, but let's say I reach the heights of Kai Whiting, you're no longer my ideal. You're no longer an ideal because I can reach you, right? Correct. And so anyways, let's talk a little bit though about sort of the pantheistic idea of God and what the Stoics believe, because for me, like when you really get into this, it's very interesting, and I'd love for you to explain it because you can explain things a lot better in an academic sense than I can. But I want to maybe say, I want to give people an analogy, something that they can recognize. And it's kind of like the Force from Star Wars, right? It's like it's in all things. It's in each of us. We're all sort of interconnected, and things are sort of governed by this Force. And that's kind of what the Stoics meant in terms of their God. But I want to hear you explain this. But what do you think of that analogy?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, if I'm going to teach it in a non-academic sense, that's how I'd say. Like, if you're a Star Wars fan, then yeah, like there is no supernatural, there is no heaven, there is no hell, right? I was saying to somebody yesterday in the Facebook things that erupted after Chris Fisher and I discussed different aspects of God, that the Stoic God is not all powerful. Stoic God is defined by nature. Yeah,
nor omniscient.
Well, you're all knowing in the sense that you are all that there is to know.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, but all knowing relative to a supernatural God. No. Right. But in terms of, because the Stoics would say that doesn't exist, so the Stoic God is all knowing because the Stoic God is all that can be known.
Exactly.
Literally.
Yeah.
Like literally.
It's all that is.
That's all that is. So we have, like even our, from the Stoic perspective, our soul is physical. It is not supernatural. It is a shape. Again, it's like the more that you are in line with the universe, the thicker your soul gets. Which is why, by the way, they say the last soul to burn through when everything goes. It's all cyclical with the Stoics. Basically, at the end of time, for want of a better word, like there's a great fire, and the last soul to burn through is the sage because it's thicker. So it's a physical thing. Like even the soul is physical. Like, and I'm not saying how much people have to believe this. I find it really useful to think, okay, am I doing something that thickens my soul or not? Am I doing something that, for me, it's actually very easy for me to conceptualize, rather than am I doing something that is pleasing to God? Because God is not. It's different. Like for me, there's an aspect that can be different, and that doesn't mean I never ask myself that question. But yeah, there's no supernatural. Like you either are aligned, it's basically like you're aligned or you're not aligned. And so if
Right.
I have an orchestra, it's not just about being the greatest violinist. It's about making everybody else sound good.
Yes.
So if you're like really going for it, and it's the best violin I've ever heard, right? But you're completely out of tune. You're not working for the cosmopolis, right? You're not working for the community around you, and therefore you're doing something that's inappropriate. And if it's inappropriate, you're not achieving eudaimonia, because it's not only. That's why I often say people don't like that. I say it's not about being the best version of Kai. It's about being the best human being I can be. People say
Yes.
to me, when I see the best version of Kai, that is the best human being you can be. I'm like, I can see if that's how you want to define it, then yes. But for me, it's like it's Stoicism is always going beyond the self, which is why being better is written in a way talking beyond yourself. Because if you're only thinking about yourself, again, you can't achieve eudaimonia, because it's about being in harmony. It's
Yes.
about it's about having the right chords and playing them, playing your role, playing your part. That's why it's not just self-help in the generic sense of the word. It's like,
Yes.
how can I be better so that the people around me are better? How can I make Brandon? How can I facilitate, things so that Brandon also can do what he does best, right? People think,
Exactly.
okay, so does that mean I can't work in the shop floor? Or do I have to be like, I don't know, a really famous inventor? No, you sweep the best you can sweep, and you do so because you know that having a really clean floor is great for people who have to walk across the floor. Like, does that mean that we all have to be this ideal, have the ideal job? No. Does that mean we have to chase? What are we chasing? Nothing. We're just cultivating. The minute you want to chase something because you think it's important to you, it says, well, Seneca says, well, you'll never sense a sense of prosperity or joy or hope. It depends on the translation. If you need something outside of you, again, if you think courage is external, it's outside of you, then you're going to be disappointed. Like people often say to me, Brandon, I need a challenge. I've had this argument as well. I need a challenge. If I don't have a challenge, how can I be a better person? I'm like, if you need a challenge, what you're saying is, in the absence of challenge, you're a terrible human being, right? So there's no hope for you. Like Stoics should be able to use both challenges and ease to cultivate their character, because their character is not dependent on having a challenge or having ease. Like, I need my life to be really easy. Like somebody wrote on Twitter like 2 days ago, oh, it must be much easier. You might have seen it. It must be much easier to be Stoic if you're a Roman emperor. Right? Complete misunderstanding of Stoicism. It is not easy. It might be more pleasurable, but it's
Right,
not
but that's
easier
not
to
Stoic.
achieve eudaimonia. It is Stoic in the sense of that you can have more pleasure. The Stoics are not anti-pleasure, right? It's more
Yeah.
pleasurable, but it doesn't mean it's easy to be a Stoic, because
Exactly.
none of that matters. But yeah, of course, the Stoics aren't dumb enough to think, you know what? I think Cleanthes, with his concussions and his poverty, his life is so much nicer and easier and pleasurable than Seneca's. It's just not true. Like, no Stoic worth their salt, either ancient or contemporary, if they think about it for 5 seconds, it's going to go, yeah, you know what? Cleanthes' life was just as easy as Marcus Aurelius's. Oh, Epictetus, that guy destroyed his hip. His life was so much easier than Seneca's. Because although Seneca had asthma, he had slaves. Epictetus was a slave. He was a well-educated slave, but he was one. That's not what Stoics are claiming. They're saying that none of these externals, none of these trimmings, in your poverty and your wealth, you can create a character that is that round circle, a round circle peg.
Yeah, and we have we have data now that sort of supports that idea. Like, you see families now that make more than, I don't know what the most recent number, I think it's like 60K USD for a family. If you make over that, self-reported happiness does not go up at all. Like, there's a certain level of income that you need, and it's a lot lower than people think, where after that you don't get any more benefit from a spiritual sense. And so we know this too, because like, if you've ever listened to a CEO talk, and they get deep into like the meaning behind their lives, like they have a meaning behind their lives, but there's like this deep depression there sometimes. And it's like, I know people that barely make any money and they're fulfilled in life. So, this Stoic idea is, you sort of see it manifest itself now in I mean, you see it. We see it in the data, and we see it, because obviously now we have billionaires and people with a lot of money, and we're very fortunate enough to be able to hear them talk about their lives and these things. And even Elon Musk I saw him talk the other day, and he was like talking about this, and he was talking about how it's like he's got this existential struggle, right? And you say, okay, yeah, but he's got lots of money. It's like, no, you're not getting it, right? And I did want to sort of highlight what you said there, because I think it's really important, because I get pushback on this, Kai. I get pushback on this a lot. Every time I say Stoicism is pro-social, people say, no, it's not. It's about going and living in the woods by yourself and living with nature. And I say, have you ever read a Stoic book? Because every Stoic book I read talks about this in some way. Stoicism is not about being the best version of yourself and only of yourself. It's about, because that's not good enough. For a Stoic, that is not good enough.
It's not good enough for a sage, yeah.
Yes. A Stoic or a sage, however you want to say it, is alignment between yourself, your community, your country, humanity as a whole. So it's not just the action that best suits your individual life. It's about you and your relation to the world around you and the circles that expand upon that. Yourself, your family, your community, your country, the world as a whole. And so the one that can sort of meet most of those circles and really keep your actions in line with the best of all of those things is the most Stoic thing to do.
Yeah, that is
very, very important.
In a nutshell, that 30 seconds is Stoicism. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that if you have a character that is such that you would be much, you would do the best you could in a wood. The Stoics never said you couldn't sit in, you could be the lumberjack, for want of a better phrase, who does sit by him or herself in the wood and looks after the local environment. If that is if that is what your calling is, in sense of Cicero took this from Pantheistic, that we have our roles, but our roles are also linked to our preferences. It's not becoming a martyr, right? It's not going, I'm going to do this because I think it's good for the planet, and I'm going to sacrifice myself. Then you're not looking after the self, right? Which is the first circle,
which is important as well.
In the circle of concern, yeah, it's you. Because how well are you going to look after the planet if you're not looking after yourself?
Yeah.
All things being equal, Stoics do recognize that you should want to be healthy. You want to eat right, do exercise. I mean, they were long distance runners. They were wrestlers. Epictetus loved wrestling as well. He loved watching it. Didn't wrestle himself for obvious reasons. But they did appreciate, being healthy where possible. Of course, they have chronic illnesses. I mean, it's an ancient period. Who didn't? So
right.
they do value that. I mean, Mercedes Rufus is talking about, being strong, and not putting too many layers on so you get cold. Cleanthes is wearing this really thin cloak, and the wind blows up, and they can see he's got no clothes on underneath, and everyone's clapping him for being really strong and masculine about it. I do wonder what they'd say if Cleanthes had been a woman, but So there is this sense of having a strong physical body. It is important to be healthy, and there's no. Again, there's no. This is the wonderful thing about Stoicism. There's no path that is, identical. That we should all do the same thing. So, what differentiates, say, the Stoic quote unquote practice from a religious one? Well, in the mosque, you're all called to do the same thing at the same time, at the same, literally the same rhythmical movements, to be quiet at the same time. And that is your devotion to God. That isn't the only devotion to God. That is salat or salah, which is the ritual prayer. In Stoicism, it's not like that. It's like you are called to try to align yourself with nature. What does that look like? Well, that depends on a whole load of aspects. It's very contextualized. When you have a religion, it's not contextual. It doesn't matter if you're in the desert, you're in the oceans, you're on a boat, you are going to pray towards Mecca. You are going to take your Bible and do the symbol of the cross, right? You're going to do certain things, and everybody's going to do those things. And I think that's, I think it's on some level that's actually wonderful. When you build, communities doing that, I'm not going to say that it's terrible. We're celebrating Christmas in the West, right? A lot of people, even if you're not Christian, everybody's doing that. Yeah. There's a ritual we don't do religious rituals. Well, you're giving presents. You're,
right.
you're letting Santa down your chimney. So like, there are things happening that you agree with. As you'd build up and say, Santa, no, you can't stop it. No, Santa for me. No, you're getting into the Christmas spirit. You've probably got a Christmas tree. I'm not saying this, and the Stoics were very cool about this. They're like, yes, we have our Roman rituals, our Roman ceremonies, and like Marcus Aurelius is like blessing the river, right? We can do all those things, as we just recognise that doesn't achieve eudaimonia.
Right.
Right. So it's not saying that Stoics neither follow rules just because they're rules, but neither do they break them just because they're rules. Like, oh, we're anarchists.
Right.
Yes, the Stoics are, but not in the way that you think, in the sense that it doesn't mean, because I'm Stoic, I'm going to hate the Christmas tree and I'm going to throw away my presents and I'm going to do whatever you think that is appropriate because you're not tied down to religion, quote unquote. There's no Stoic reason to give a present or to throw one in the bin. It depends who's giving it to you, why they're giving it to you, what does it mean. As we said in Being Better about whether we drink milk or not, there are days that somebody pours milk in my tea, I'll drink it. Because if I throw it away, it's still wasted. Like, I didn't save the cow now the milk is gone in my tea. Like, when you'd save the cow, would I? Because I think the milk's already there. Yeah. There's nothing I can do about it. Of course I can tell somebody, next time you make me a tea, I actually prefer it black. But to throw it away in front of them, or try to sneak it, that's not going to make them feel any better about me as a human being. That's not going to create harmony. Stoics are very big on harmony.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great thing you mentioned Christmas, because we're sort of in this phase now where, like, a lot of people in the West are not Christians in any way in the real sense of the word, yet we still celebrate Christmas. And, I've always thought about it like if you want to say, okay, I don't want to celebrate Christmas anymore because I'm not a Christian anymore, but it's ingrained into our society. Like, we all have Christmas holidays. It's recognized at work that during Christmas time, things are a little bit slower. It's like, yeah, okay, you can stand by your ideology and say, I'm not going to celebrate Christmas, I'm not going to go have Christmas dinner. But you only lose things when you say that. You don't gain anything. Like, if you get rid of Christmas, yeah, okay, sure, you're in line with your ideology, but then you lose Christmas.
Well, you lose family connections. You can lose Christmas.
And that's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
That's what I don't mean Christmas in the Christian sense of the word. I mean Christmas how we celebrate it today, which is like time to get home for the family, time to exchange some gifts, time to have meal together, break bread together, have some laughs, play some music. Like, not so much the fundamental, I guess, religious belief that's underneath it, but sort of like if you were to ask a Westerner, hey, are you excited for Christmas? Yeah, I am. Get to see the family, get to eat some food, get to have a few beer, get to open some gifts. Like, it's these things, right? And so again, it's like, yeah, you can stand by your ideology, but you're just going to lose that. You're not going to gain anything, right? I wanted to talk about religion just a little bit because, and you had a talk with, was it Stoicism Thailand?
Yeah.
The one that okay. So, and that's a great talk. Yeah. I'll put that in the show notes for people, but that was a great talk that you had there. But there was something there that I wanted to sort of challenge you on just a little bit, because it sort of, I think in the same way where we take the word God and throw it in the bin because, it's God, right? It's the man in the clouds. I think we do the same thing with religion. I think a lot of times when people say religion, they don't mean religion, they mean dogma. Right. And so and I'm still sort of struggling with this idea myself, like sort of what it means to be religious. And I'm reading a lot about ancient religions at the moment. But for me, it's like religion in the broadest sense of the word is practicing things in a way that I suppose is in line with God. And again, God in the broadest definition of the word. Like, what does that mean? Something sacramental, sort of, so to speak, right? Something sacred, something above yourself. And so any activity that is in line with that, to me, is a religious activity. And I really want to sort of, gel with you a little bit here and sort of figure out where we connect or where we disconnect, because it's interesting to me.
I think, that's why you could say football is religion. Right, people do say, when I say football, I mean soccer for people in the North America. Football is a religion, right? And why do I think this on some aspects? You get 50,000 Liverpool fans sing We Will Never Walk Alone. They will do that in harmony. There'll be no arguments. Everyone's happy. You ask them to talk about immigration. You ask them to talk about God. You ask them to talk about whatever. When the bin should be collected if it should be collected on a Tuesday or a Thursday or a Saturday, or when the pubs should be open till. They'll argue. They'll argue like you wouldn't believe. But in that moment of chorus, like today in Anfield Stadium, we are going to sing because we've just won the cup that we'll never walk alone. You'll get 50 to 60,000 fans holding a scarf and standing in unison and doing it. And the people outside who couldn't get a ticket will also hear it and pick up their scarf and do exactly the same thing. That is a religious aspect. It is a collective act of adoration. And that's not towards a God. So I don't necessarily think that there has to, depending on what you want to use by the word religion, but you can have religious aspects with anything that you adore, right? And they would say that's higher than themselves, right? That sense of self is no longer just, say, Kai. It's Kai as a Liverpool supporter.
And that's what I think religious actually means. I think it is recognizing that you are not alone, or feeling that you're not alone. Like when people go into nature, like so many people report this, they go out and they walk in the woods and they just feel like Ralph Waldo Emerson had a really great phrase on this, but it was like, he goes in and he's an eyeball. He's just taking in, like he is one with nature and he's taking in everything. And so to me, that's really what the deep religious thing is. And when you say a religion, people think, organized religion. And so I guess where I'm at personally is I'm trying to figure out if we continue with the word of religion, or if we do what we did sort of like with Stoicism, or do we dig up the foundations of what that word really means and use it appropriately, or do we just scratch the word off and then move on with new definitions? I feel if we do that, we're really at risk of losing what that word has the potential to mean.
So Stoics have always been big on definitions. Theorist, who's mentioned in chapter 7, that people don't really know about, actually. He's the guy who went to Sparta and taught the Spartan king Stoic principles so that they could have a reformation. Reform land issues, reform economics. So if you're interested in that, it's chapter 7. But the point that I want to make is that he's actually really well known for making good definitions. In the ancient world, if you couldn't define a term, you lost the argument. So I see a lot in the counterculture issue where people say about what racism happens to be, and then there's not an even agreement on the definition, right? And you go, well, my definition of racism is to judge somebody in function of solely or merely because of the color of their skin or ethnicity, right? Because it may be that skin color can be difficult because there's different tones, right? And your version of racism is something different. But yours is secular reasoning, mine is not, right? So definitions are fundamental, and I don't want to police words. Like when people say to me, why do we use the word God? I'm like, firstly, I don't believe any religion or faith, capital F, should have a monopoly on God. God's too big. God's too big. I don't want to go around policing people's words. I really dislike the fact that you cannot say things like somebody's a woman these days without having ask J.K. Rowling about that. And it's like I may disagree with elements of it or nuances, but who am I to say that she shouldn't be allowed to use a word? In fact, 3 days ago she was on Twitter saying like, I think it was like ignorance is knowledge. What is it? Strength is weakness and things like that. The Orwellian lines.
1984.
Yeah. And a person who has a penis who attacks a woman in a certain way. They are a woman, right? So and then people are saying it's transphobic and this is terrible, and it's like, hang on a minute, but what's your definitions here? What is she actually saying? And instead of having, like in the ancient world, you had to debate, going, okay, first of all, do we agree on definitions? Because if we don't, we can't have a debate. And now can you defend your definition of let's say, what a woman is and why you think that? So I'm really much like, if people want to use the word God in the music, if people want to use the word woman in their way, I don't have to agree with it, like per se. I just, in that discussion, I have to know what you mean by that. So I don't automatically assume something about you. Again, this is again a very Stoic concept of What's my impression? Right? And if at some point when I debate people on the Stoic God, because it seems to be that there is more interest in that, the first thing we have to establish is what does your God mean? For the same reason I said, what happens if my God is a tree? Telling me that my God doesn't exist. It's a very simple example, but you're dumb you're very dumb. Let's put it that way. Keep it clean. You're very dumb by saying that. If you tell me that Christmas means whatever you say it means, I might say, you know what? Well, let's say I'm not a Christian and I don't believe that. That doesn't mean that your Christmas is useless. It doesn't mean that it's stupid. It just means that we disagree, and we disagree for certain reasons. Now, the other thing is that we don't have to agree. There's this thing at the moment with which I would call the woke left of the US, particularly of the US, where we must all be in agreement. Because if we're not, you're on the wrong side of history. Well, history's cyclical, and it's a very strong statement to say. For example, if you believe in God and you're a Stoic, you're the wrong side of history, right? Because that is why we used to be called the blog Stoicism Today. And then for political reasons, in my opinion, it got changed to modern Stoicism. Well, what's modern about saying that there's no God? Because most people today believe in God. So what's modern about saying there's no God? I can't see that. It doesn't seem modern to me. It's a statement of faith in the sense that there is nothing that you can show me that would demonstrate any more that there is a God. I've got to the point that there's nothing you can show me. There's no further I can go to prove to me that there is no God. I've gone as far as I can go. You can show me that there's a God, right? So they don't say you can't show me. They say there's nothing further that I need to do to come to the conclusion that there is no God. Okay, but you can show me, right? You could show me there's a God, because I don't find most atheists are not like, well, there's nothing you can show me. That's not. They think about it. That's not true. Because then if there's nothing you can show me, then that's just to believe. Go, I'm going to shut my eyes because there's nothing you can show me. The same as a Christian. Go, there's nothing you can show me to prove to me that Jesus Christ is not God. Right? They're using the same thing. So a lot of atheists aren't actually like that. They say there's no further step I can take to become more atheist. But I don't think that makes you modern. I just think that makes you a contemporary person with a set of beliefs. Or the lack of them. Yeah. So, again, none of them would say to me, because when they say atheist, meaning without God, I'm like, do you mean that you don't believe my treatise? Right? They're actually making a specific set of claims. And again, I'm not debating about whether their claims are right or wrong. I'm just saying, if you take God out of Stoicism, what you have is self-help. But not Stoicism. If you take Jesus Christ out of Christianity, you might have a quote-unquote nice set of beliefs. You might have some crazy set of beliefs too, but you're likely to have a very nice set of beliefs. The Golden Rule, for example. But you don't have Christianity. In fact, you don't even have Islam, because Isa is a prophet who comes back, and he's actually the Messiah. People don't realize that the Messiah in Islam is Jesus, right? So you don't even have Islam. You have something different, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just don't call it. Don't call it Stoicism if you've just ripped out the heart of Stoicism. And it is the foundation. The whole reason that one can claim that virtue is the only good is precisely because of the theology. You can claim virtue is good. You're in virtue ethics. So my question would be to somebody, why the obsession about why is it important to call yourself a Stoic? Because that is what you're saying. Say, I'm an atheist, and I want to call myself a Stoic. And you can do. I'm not here to tell you you're not a Stoic just because you happen to be an atheist. I'm just telling you you've got a load of cognitive dissonance, and you'll prove it to yourself when you get you want proof, like you say, there's nothing you can show me. Get a black marker pen, read Meditations, and every time you hear the word providence, divine, and God, black it out. This is objective. And then look back at how many blacked out pages you've got, or sentences you've got. Black it out. And then tell me what you have left. And then what you have left is what you've got. And you'll find it don't make sense. That's an objective thing you can do. Now, you might say, that's ridiculous. Well, okay, but then you're not basing your claim that Stoicism doesn't need a God on anything.
Yeah.
Other than your own conviction that there is no God.
Yeah, I kind of see it like we do this all the time with philosophies, because we build our identity. We like to attach our identity to philosophies or religions, right? And it's kind of like, I kind of see it like, I don't know, like a wall of plastic, right? And you have this philosophy, and then what you do is, you immerse yourself into this plastic, and so you're sort of attached to it, but it's kind of like elastic, right? So what you do, okay, when something doesn't align with what you think and what the religion or philosophy thinks, okay, you resist the plastic a little bit, right? I know this is sort of a weird analogy, but this is sort of how
you give yourself wiggle room. What you're doing is you're wriggling. I quite like
you're
this.
wiggling.
It's exactly what you do. You wriggle until you wriggle out so far that you're outside of it.
Yeah. Well, that's it.
You keep doing that. I like the wriggling. That was really helpful.
But it's like whenever something disagrees, you have to hold that, right? You have to like stand strong, and it's something that you have to take responsibility over. And what happens eventually, and I think you mentioned this on your podcast with Simon, or one of the podcasts, is something happens when you take a philosophy and then you start bending it. Either the philosophy breaks and you realize that it's no longer one that you want to follow, or you break. Like something has to break because there's conflict here. Things are not lining up. Things are not aligned. And so it's very interesting. And the one last thing I wanted to say there is, we talk about disagreeing with each other in the West here, and we do this. We all feel like, we need to agree. But I think what we've lost is we've lost agreement in the higher level philosophy. And that you can call that the law if you want. But let's say, for example, I practice Stoicism, and I have this is how I want to live my life. And then you practice Christianity, and that's how you want to live your life. For us to have, now, you could argue, that within the philosophy itself, there's agreement that you let other people do as they wish, right? But fundamentally, we have to agree that you should be able to do what you want to do, and I should be able to do what I want to do, given, of course, we're not harming each other, and we're yada, 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 right? But what we're doing there is we're both following our own personal philosophy, but we're both subservient to something higher, and that is that you should be able to do what you want to do, and I should be able to do what I want to do. And what we're doing is we're ignoring all that, and we're saying, no. You have to agree with what I agree. And so it's this big disconnect there. What do you think about that?
There is, and the funny thing about Stoicism is that no one would dream to go into a church and tell people at church that Jesus Christ is not real, but they want to be a Christian. Right? This is the key thing that I find really interesting. Because they'll go, well, Kai, you're really holding on to quote-unquote doctrine by saying that the Stoics believe this, but that's what they believe. Like, would you go into a church, go up to the altar, stand up there and say, Jesus Christ did not die on a cross. Jesus Christ died swimming, right? Like, I just don't believe that he would die on a cross, which is actually a Muslim belief, right? They believe that he didn't die on the cross, that he was placed on the cross, but then removed because it's not fitting for a prophet to die on the cross. Okay. That's a Muslim belief. Although the swimming one, it is this example of other people don't believe they die on the cross. But imagine I go up to the altar in the church and go, I want to be a Christian. I'm like the best Christian ever. But he died swimming. Okay. Where does it say that? But the people come into Stoicism, and big names come in, and people who are not known, and say, but we don't need that anymore. We don't need that. So why do you feel the need to call yourself a Christian if you don't believe that Jesus Christ didn't die on the cross? You can say you're influenced by Christianity. You can say you love aspects of Christianity. But why would you feel the need to become a Christian? Why is that label, it's just a label, why is that label so important to you if the fundamental things that make it that label are things you dislike?
Yeah, it's important though. It's really important that we get these definitions right, because so many people, first of all, so many people think Stoicism is a state of mind. It's not a philosophy. I'm sure you've heard that. It's just like, really? And then you dig a little bit deeper and you're like, oh, there's a second definition of Stoicism. It's a philosophy. And then you start learning about that. And this is something that I just love about Stoicism, is that it's so deep. It's so deep. I'm still learning so many aspects of Stoicism. But it's like you said, you have to come into it as a learner, as opposed to, okay, I'm just going to bend this to my will. It's like, that's not how it works.
That's what letter 33 says. People claim letter 33 is a Seneca's letter, about there are guides, not our masters, and they use it as a get-out clause, right? Therefore, I don't need to believe in the God. Therefore, you don't need to believe that there's 4 virtues then. So why don't you throw that under the bus as well, right? Well, if you're going to pick and choose, throw that under the bus as well. And why don't you throw under the bus Cosmopolis? And why don't you throw under? He doesn't say that though. If you read that letter, it is obvious that he says the following. Once you know the foundations, once you really understand Stoicism, you know what it says. then you do no longer need, when you've got an application, when you've got a challenge, you can therefore use the Stoicism in your way to guide yourself. You do not need someone to tell you what to do because you already have the foundation. So if you say to me, Kai, I want to get married to this person, I'm like, what's your opinion? I can give you my opinion, but you don't need to follow it, right? But because you'd say, well, I'm a Stoic and this is why I'm asking you. Because I imagine if you wanted to know ask a question about whether you should marry someone, you'd ask somebody else. And then I'd say, well, you know the foundations. I've taught you the foundations and somebody else has taught you the foundations. And I agree that your foundations are strong. And this is my advice. And my advice will always be as a Stoic in form of questions. Right? Because I shouldn't tell you what to do. But I should say to you, that doesn't mean that I don't tell you what to do in the beginning when you know nothing. Like you don't know, absolutely anything. You don't know anything. I'm going, okay, I'm not going to tell you what to do because you choose. I'm your guide, not your master, right? That's not how it works. Epictetus 101, dichotomy of control, literally 1.1 discourses. Everyone's like, yes, part of Stoicism is this. It's mentioned once, really, once. So why do you get attached to 1.1? Like he taught them that. So you want to accept that, but you don't accept the God that they spent the entire time talking about because it was fundamental to their ethics. Like the dichotomy of control is just the mechanism that comes in place once you accept that virtue is the only good and that you accept that you would like to align yourself to God. Then you go, okay, how do you do that? First thing you do, Resolution 101, you recognize what's in your control and what is not. Or what I prefer to say, what corresponds to you and what does not. That's a mechanism. It's not a fundamental tenet of Stoicism. Because believe it or not, a lot of people would say to you, well, the serenity prayer. What is up to you and what's not? That's not a fundamentally Stoicism. People are like, that's fundamentally Stoic. No, it's just common sense. Like the minute you stop worrying about things that are not in your control, that doesn't mean don't care. Because somebody said on Twitter, which I corrected, oh, if it's out of your control, just don't care about it. I'm like, your mum's out of your control. She doesn't do what you want her to do. Does that mean you shouldn't care? It was a bit stronger than that. The language was stronger. Don't give a about this person. Or about this thing. I'm like, yeah, but I really care about you, Brandon, and you know that. You're not in my control. As much as I'd like you to be. Yeah. But you're not, right? So does that mean I don't give anything about you? No. It just means that I accept there are moments that I can influence you, because you're my friend, that's in my control. It's in my control to be able to influence certain things. But ultimately, it's to take a step back and be happy with whatever you chose. Because to do otherwise, it's going to make you miserable. So that's why Masonic River says that. Like, if God gave you exile instead of death, just it's different, then you should be happy with that. Why ask for the greater burden if God gave you the lesser one? Whatever you choose, let's imagine you say, I want my advice. I really don't think you should marry this lady because this, and this. But I would ask you questions like, why do you think, right? And it would come to I would come to a conclusion based on your answers that she's not the right person for you. Go, but I want to marry her. Good luck, mate. I'll be there. I'm your mate. Like, that's it. Like, as long as I don't have to get involved and, like, influence my life to the nth degree, then you do what you want. And then in 10 years' time, if you say to me, we didn't get divorced, but it was blinking difficult. My life has been so tough. And go, well, when I asked you a set of questions, you must have known that was the case. And you went there anyway. But I'm happy for you because the alternative is what? That's what it means to be able to distinguish between what's in your control and what's not. To be happy with what's not in your control, because the alternative is what? Nihilism?
Yeah, and that was really, really well said. I'm glad you talked about that. That was great. I'm glad you mentioned nihilism at the end because it was the next little piece I wanted to add in here. I want to make a case against nihilism. I'm probably not the first in history. It won't be the last. Nihilism, for those who don't know, is basically the assumption that there is no meaning. There's no meaning to life. There's never any meaning. And I think we're dangerously close to this. I feel like modern people, particularly Westerners, are sort of on this, they're on the edge of the cliff kind of thing. And they're just like a lot of, particularly young people, they're really existentially, let's say, dissatisfied. Like they just have this crisis, and it almost seems like they're just on that edge. And I think it comes from this idea, first, okay, so the problem with nihilism, as far as I can see, I'm sure you would agree, is that if there's no meaning, if there's no meaning to life, well then why the hell does anything you do ever matter? And at the point in which you decide that, okay, something matters, it's not really nihilism, because now you're attaching a meaning to life itself. Now, here's the thing. From a chemical perspective, we know, we're going to get right down to the atoms here. We know that things are going to disintegrate over time. Like, scientifically, they know that everything's going to fall apart eventually. Nothing is going to be permanent. So if you look forward, billions and billions of years, life is not the planet. From what we know now, it's not going to be anything from what we understand it to be right now. So that scientific discovery, I think, has led to this idea of nihilism, or at least the susceptibility to nihilism, to say, okay, well, if in the long term that's going to happen, then life has no meaning. Therefore, life has no meaning. And my challenge to that is, why the hell are you looking at it for the next billion years, for the next 2 billion years? Like, just because, let's say long term, even if let's accept that we know that we're 100% certain that long term that's going to happen, and we have no meaning in the long term. Does that mean to say that you have no meaning right now? Does that mean to say that you have no meaning in this moment, or in a year, or in 10 years? Does that mean that if you're going to go see your family this Christmas, do you mean to tell me that's not meaningful because we're all going to be dead in 100 years? And so my challenge to this, and I'm really just throwing this, I'm bouncing it off you because I want to know what you think about this, but I think that's important. I think when you're talking about meaning, when you're talking about life, when you're talking about these sort of very deep existential questions, what time frame are you looking at? And I think it's really fundamental to the question of, does life have meaning?
You're going to hate me for saying this, but that's a Jordan Peterson argument.
I don't hate you.
No, because people have to say, they're going to nod and they're going to agree with you until I tell them that is a Jordan Peterson argument. Jordan Peterson says specifically, any idiot, and I agree with him on this, any idiot can come up with a long enough time frame that has meaningless. Yeah, great. And I laugh when I was actually sweeping my floor. I love listening to John Pearson when I'm sweeping my floor, because I like the way he makes me think. Because people think, oh, I don't know the way he thinks, right? Or why does he make you think? Right, that's what's in your control. That's why you should listen to somebody, not just because you agree with them, or disagree with them, depending on how you're feeling about it, but what it makes you think, what sparks in your mind. From a Stoic perspective, epistemologically speaking, there is no past nor future. That's why they're not consequentialists. That's why an appropriate action doesn't suddenly become inappropriate because the consequences were such that somebody died, let's say. The only thing that exists is literally now, which is why and this is in book 2 actually that Leah and I are writing, Musonius corrects Epictetus. He says, it's not like I burnt down the Capitol. He said, this is the Capitol, the big building, government building in Rome. Why? Because you made a mistake in the only way you could make it. Right now, you made a mistake in logic. That's the only mistake you could have made. End of story. You made it. So Epictetus then, because he then speaks to a student who's in equal disbelief that there's equality of errors, that one error is no worse than any other. He's like, it's not like doing this, I killed my father. And Epictetus says, where is the father for you to kill? Like, don't give me the hypotheticals. We're not the trolley people, because people say, oh, would you push this lever or this lever? That's not a Stoic discussion. They're not interested. They're like, are you standing by the levers? Firstly, no. Then irrelevant. Are you ever going to be standing by levers? Like, oh yes, because in my job is to push levers. Okay. How often are people tied to the tracks in your job? Have you ever seen that? No. Then the likelihood of that. Have you heard of anybody working in that situation that's happened? No. It's not. The Stoics like, well, why would I do that? When you know what's really important? What I'm doing right now. That's the only thing that matters. So, from a Stoic perspective, the only thing that matters is this moment. The only thing that has meaning is this moment right now. 4:04, 16:29, my time, point you. That's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing in my control. Everything else is either gone, doesn't exist, or is in the future. So it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that we should not factor in more. I think if I swear on the Brandon's podcast, then we have to put an explicit warning, and I don't want to do that, right? And the way I talked about saying that, I want it to be open to people to be able to listen to it without having to worry about things, right? Like, I make choices based on that because that's being reasonable. So from a Stoic perspective, the only thing that matters and has meaning is what you're doing right now. Your attitude you're having, your action, and your thought. Because everything else, my friends, is outside of your control. So this is this crazy thing that everyone gets really high. Like, yes, that can't be control. I'm like, yeah, but then you go and become more consequential on me. Then you start telling me, how do I find meaning? Well, in the moment, because nothing else is in your control. Like, if you take it to its logical conclusion, you come to the only conclusion you can come to. That right now, and now 16:30, that's the only thing in my control. And everything else doesn't matter. Does that mean that life has no meaning? No, it means life is moment by moment, and that's when it has meaning. That's the only time it can have meaning, by definition from the Stoics. So, nihilism, I don't really have an issue with nihilism in the sense that you can tell me that life has no meaning, right? But you've got clothes on, but if it had no meaning, why did you put a jumper on? Like, you put a jumper on for a reason, right? And you go, well, that was only because, but then you attach need to put clothes to the meaning of what is reasonable in society, what's reasonable in the street. Why have you ever cut your hair as an adult? Like, it falls down on the most basic of things. This is why I'm so strong about the Stoic concept, because I don't think it falls down. I don't think you can say to me, actually, life has meaning in 50 years' time. Like, how do you know that? You don't know that. And does it matter? Like, the only thing that's going to make it matter is if you do the right thing now. So I always say to people, if you do what's appropriate now, the next minute will take care of itself. If you do the appropriate thing today, tomorrow will take care of itself. So don't worry about tomorrow. This is also a Christian thing, of course. Don't worry about tomorrow because God will look after you. The Stoic point of view is, don't worry about tomorrow as long as you're taking, because there's no point. Take care of the moment, because if you take care of the moment, you won't need to worry about tomorrow.
Yeah. That's a very important thing to clarify, is living in the moment from the Stoic perspective. It's not about only doing things for that particular moment. The future is considered in that calculation, but again, it's looking at this particular moment that you have and what you can do that's fully in line with, again, the community, yourself, the world as a whole, towards the ultimate goal of virtue. That was great, man. I think
I'm glad that you made that caveat, because I was really got in trouble. But yeah, that's a John Peterson argument, though, unfortunately, in the sense that I like the thing that he says in his Beyond Order, when he said, which self do you want to pay attention to? The Kai right now, the Kai tomorrow, the Kai... Like, you've got a community of selves, which again is a very sort of... The Stoics would go, yes, that's right. So you're absolutely right. It's not that I'm just going to be like hedonistic. Yes, just live for the moment. No, you live in the moment, not for the moment.
Not for, yeah, because it's now, and then the dimension is time. So it's like you have Stoic philosophy in this present moment, but then built into that calculation is how that's going to propagate over time. It's a very hard thing to conceptualize, at least for me. But that was great, man. I think maybe we'll start to end off there. I think we pretty much touched on everything I wanted to touch on. Obviously went through some areas that I wasn't expecting, but that's good. I like that. Keep it fresh. Did you want to announce the little thing that...
I do, yes. So Brandon and I have decided that we're going to do... I've not dragged you into it, but we're going to do an Ask Us Anything on Stoicism. If you are a listener, then stay tuned. If you have bought a copy of the book or borrowed one, so that includes from a sibling, if you can get a picture of you with Being Better, Stoicism for Well Worth Living In, or a stamp from the library with the cover to show me that you've done that, it's not a case of you need to buy, go out and buy it, that's not the case, then that's great. We would like to open up the opportunity to have some questions from you. If you've been a long-term supporter of Brandon, the same is true. So we're going to work out the details, but yes, please come along and ask us anything. You could type it, because I know some people would be uncomfortable speaking it. You don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to show your face on the camera necessarily. Just as long as your username would tie into the list we'll have about people who have been long-term supporters / people who have borrowed / bought the book, then we'll know from the username that you're going to use that yes, that person, priorities on the questions, for example. But more news to come on that.
Yeah, details to follow, but I'm really looking forward to that, man. That's going to be fun, and we'll figure it out too. Like maybe we can do it questions. Like if you wanted to email the questions in beforehand, like we can definitely do that. But details to work out. But the bottom line is, and I'm just going to say this very, very openly, but I tend to get really good feedback when you come on. So people like our gel, let's say it like that. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's going to be in the new year. This episode will come out, I think, on the 7th of January or so, and then we'll probably look near the end of January, maybe mid-February, for a timeline to actually do it, and then details to follow. So thanks so much for coming on, Kai, man. Listen, I had a blast. I'm always a pleasure to have you on and talk to you, and I love the sweater. People need to people need to get on the YouTube video and look at the sweater, or the Instagram. You can check it out there too. But yeah, man, love the sweater. Thanks for coming on. Any final words for up and coming Stoics?
No, just when one thing I would say: if you identify as a Stoic, make sure you know the reasons why.
Love it. All right, Kai. Thanks again. Until next time.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.